Thanks and welcome to Intro to Governance today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. And as you might be aware, this is part of our Integral Intros series where we present overviews of the areas of expertise that Integral.org provides, which includes nonprofit financials, risk management, legal compliance, and of course, nonprofit governance. My name is Liz Tang. I use pronoun she, her, and I'm the program coordinator for Integral.org. I'll be hosting and monitoring the chat and doing some tech support. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any troubles related to that. But without further ado, we'll just hop into our line acknowledgement. Thank you. So we acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples, presently subject to Treaties 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements in the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all the First Peoples of Canada who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. And we make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside and work on today. There we go. So very happy to introduce our facilitator, Mike Grogan. He's the president and CEO of Integral.org, and he's worked for the nonprofit sector for over 25 years, building his ability to inspire nonprofit organizations to tackle complex issues and create effective and sustainable solutions to organizational and community issues. So as I said, I'll be around for the duration of the workshop and available for any tech support. So please just message me on chat if you do need anything, and I hope you guys all enjoy the session. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz, and thanks for taking over the duties of admitting people as they roll in, which I apparently cannot handle very well. So, and thanks to you all for joining us. Mike Grogan, pleased to have you here. So excited about this session. We do a lot of work in board governance down at Integral.org. So to have you join us with an introduction to governance and looking at who's here today, we certainly see a huge range of organizations from all over the province, big organizations, small, all kinds of parts of the nonprofit sector, from arts to human service organizations, education groups. So it speaks well, I think, of this province. So we have such a rich and broad and passionate nonprofit sector. Also, all kinds of ranges of experience from the call. I'm looking at some of the folks here thinking, hey, why are you not teaching this session? So I'm really glad that you're here, and we'll hope to incorporate enough material that, gives a little something for everybody. Today, we're going to talk about some very basic principles of nonprofit governance, sort of what does it mean to be a nonprofit board, to be a director, what are some of the challenges out there, some of the different roles and responsibilities that we have collectively and individually. I want to talk about what we're seeing partly through our work, but partly through what we just read about in terms of understanding the overall sectors, what's happening and what are the issues in governance these days? What are people wrestling with? I want to talk about 3 tensions of governance I think we always wrestle with. And then a concept called governance as leadership and how we move beyond some of the basics of governance, and then some resources and tools. So that's a lot to get through in about the next 45 minutes or so. But as Liz says, if you've got questions or comments or rebut something, throw it into the chat there. Liz will take a little break partway through, and at the end, we'll certainly have time for some questions to work through. I want to start with a quote. And I like to use quotes in what I do, but I mean, when I do these presentations, and I love this quote. This is from an article from Stanford's Social Innovation Review about a year ago, talking about the role of boards. And we won't get into a ton of that content, but the opening quote in this article, or one of the opening quotes, was that boards are a unique and curious leadership structure. That line alone, I think you could spend 45 minutes on talking about the structure of boards and what boards really are. And there's really nothing quite like a board of governors, especially in the nonprofit sector. But boards are a unique and curious leadership structure. They have significant power, but only as a collective, since no individual board member can enact anything independently. They sit up both atop and outside the structure, organizational structure, with a role that is accountable to those outside the organization as well as those within. So we'll touch on all those pieces, but that's how I like to frame this. It is this curious and unique leadership structure that in some ways we know a lot about. There are lots of theories, there's lots of regulatory work in there. There's some principles of governance, as we'll talk about today. But even that being said, they still have this sort of unique piece to them that makes them hard to understand and harder to work with sometimes, but also incredibly rich. And that is the world of nonprofit governance. In a little more concrete definition, this is from the sort of Public Accountants of Canada. The board is responsible for all aspects of the organization, including overseeing its operations and holding management accountable for delivering on the mission of the organizations. Boards are required to make decisions that are in the organization's best interests. What this tells us is that boards are the legal entity that have all the responsibility, the authority, and accountability for an organization. So when we think about a board is, it is certainly a volunteer position. It is one that comes with, though, a great deal of responsibility. And you are the legal entity that is responsible for all the organization. We can delegate some of that away as board members. Sometimes we do that to staff, sometimes to other parts of the board, perhaps. But then at the end of the day, the buck stops with the board. So you are the legal group. We are the legal group that are responsible for all aspects of the organization. And we'll sort of unpack that as we walk through this afternoon. We want to take a poll to start with here. I want to get a sense of your understanding of governance. And as I see from the list of who registered, there's a whole bunch of different folks on the call. So we want to talk about, on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your understanding of nonprofit governance? So maybe pop it in there. I'll watch numbers appear at random. We've got sort of 1 at the bottom. I'm kind of new to this world. 5, I understand quite a bit. I should be teaching this workshop, and perhaps Mike shouldn't be. So we'll see who. Oh, lots of 5s. Excellent. Fantastic. So good. Can we share that, Liz? Is it shareable now?
Yep. Share. There we go.
There. Wow, I can see it. So quite a range. I mean, I think almost evenly split, about 20% in that top range, like a quarter in each of the next 2 down, but down from the whole range of perspectives here, which is great. I think this is what not just makes sessions like this good, but this is what makes governance really, I think, quite powerful, is that you have people with all kinds of experiences, all kinds of expertise or insights, and even folks who I think are very good at nonprofit governance need to attend to a lot of these concepts. We do quite a bit of work one-on-one with boards, where we'll work with coaching boards or teaching boards or working through workshops with boards. And it doesn't matter how big the board is or how sophisticated the board is or how new or old the board is. All boards, I think, need to come back to some of these principles of governance and how they work within your organization or their organization. So we'll do workshops for large $100 million funders and ones for $100,000 organizations on almost the same content. And it really is that idea that where you sit, you still need to attend to your governance function. So a few things to think about in that regard. What are the roles and responsibilities? We'll start to talk a bit about what each of the parts of the entity of being a board has to sort of attend to. So we'll talk about individual directors. So boards are a collective. They work as a collective. We will get to that in a minute. But you're made up of individuals. So individual board members appointed or elected to a board have some duties. And really each individual duty has a fiduciary duty. That's the very foundational piece. That is what it means to be on a board. And to be a fiduciary really means that you have a legal duty to care for another entity's benefit, another person or another the other entity. So you're the one who is there to make sure that the other entity, in this case a nonprofit, is taken care of. That is a legal duty. Within that, there are 2 components to this. There is the duty of care, which is to act with the competence and diligence that a reasonably prudent person with similar knowledge and expertise would exercise in comparable circumstances. There's a lot in that. There's a little bit of subjective piece to that. But there's some really important pieces of that. And this talks about skill and diligence, that you do have to be informed. You do have to be aware and bring your skills to governing the organization, the decisions you make, the type of work you do in a board, the way you engage with the content of a board or an organization. But what's different about this is you're asked to do this as with the skill that would come with a person with similar knowledge and expertise. And you're not coming to be an expert necessarily. You're coming to be somebody who has you're making a reasonable decision. So the word reasonable is really important in this definition. So you don't have to be the experts. You have to do what would a reasonable person with similar knowledge and experience bring to that discussion. And similar knowledge and experience is a bit subjective, because if you're an accountant and you're on a board making financial decisions, the standard that you probably have to bring is a little different than somebody who doesn't have an accounting background. So your skills and expertise differ. It doesn't mean that if you're not an accountant, you don't have to be informed. They don't have to weigh in on accounting matters. You're still responsible. but that level of sort of reasonable competence or reasonable decision-making with similar experience sort of follows our own individual experience. The duty of care is to care for the organization, to be diligent about it, to be attentive to it, to make make decisions that are in the best interest of the organization. The duty of loyalty goes with that. It's similar to it, but a little bit different. It is to act honestly and in good faith, and again, make decisions in the best interest of the organization. This where we get into areas of self-interest and conflict of interest. And are we making decisions that are fully for the organization? So we avoid conflict of interest, we come prepared for meetings. We're able to make decisions that are in best interest of the organization. So those are the two major duties of board members. Those ones are always keep in mind as we work as a board. And those are the fiduciary duties really attached almost always only to the board. Members don't necessarily have fiduciary duties. They don't have to make decisions in the best interest of the organizations. Staff work for organizations perhaps, but as a fiduciary, this is one that is really in the realm of the board. And this is where the legal responsibility and the authority of the board sit in their ability to enact this type of work. So where does this come from? Within the fiduciary responsibility, you have the duty to act within the scope of your authority. Boards cannot just do whatever they want. There is some laneways to the decisions we can make as a board member. The first is a very big, broad one we don't tend to read a whole lot, is the act under which you were formed. So for most nonprofits in Alberta, that would be the Societies Act. There are other parts, the Companies Act, some different smaller acts, some older ones that have sort of lingered over the years. But the act sort of tells you the very, very broad laneways of how you should act as a board. Moving down from that, you move into objects, why you were formed, what the organization is about. You only do certain things as a nonprofit, and if you are a charity as well, then your purposes as a charity will give you another laneway to act within. So as we start from that very broad, from the act to your objects and purposes, perhaps, that's another laneway moving down. Bylaws, which every organization has, sometimes maybe called articles. This is how you'll be governed. These are how the members are, appointed or elected, or how you be a member, what the roles of members are, how meetings are run, those sorts of things. So some of those sort of foundational governance pieces that give us sort of the how you will do things. Then you get into policies, and policies are the next level down. That's sort of the board making some decisions how they're going to organize their own work, how the organization will organize its work. And then down to procedures in terms of how we carry these things out. So I picture this a bit of a funnel. From a very broad one, we don't necessarily need to think about a whole lot at the top from the act, to really specific things like down into policies and procedures. When we're talking about conflict of interest, those are the areas that boards need to set some rules and some parameters for themselves as to how they should best serve their mandate and their organization. So a couple things to think about how the board works. This is those individual sort of duties. Now we talk about the board as a collective. A couple things to keep in mind. The board focuses on the whole organization. The boards are responsible for everything in the organization. That overall responsibility and duty as a board member. That means you're focusing on the whole piece. So if you come as an accountant, again, you're not just there to do the financial statements. If you're a lawyer, you're not just there to say I'm going to deal with the legal pieces. The board as a whole focuses on the entire organization, not just those programs or those functionaries that are of interest to us or fit our own background. As a board, we're responsible for the whole thing, and therefore we need to focus on the whole entity. That we work together as a whole. That's the board having significant power, but only as a collective. There are generally no extra powers given to different positions. You might have some different roles assigned to different positions, but the power comes from the collective. So you need to work together as a whole and speak with one voice. When a board speaks, it speaks with one statement. You may have all kinds of disagreements as you sit around a board table where it's kind of behind closed doors, and you may go 1,000 directions. But when you speak publicly to the public, to get up the public or to your staff or to whoever your stakeholders, there is one consistent voice from the board, which is really important because you don't want to have an organization that says, well, part of the board thinks this and part thinks that, and somebody else thinks something else. It does not give the sense that there is unity, that you're actually working together as a collective and focusing your work in a aligned direction. Boards approve policy and monitor impact. So we'll talk about the different way boards work, but boards and all boards have policies, and they enact their work through writing policies. So that is something to think about. Even boards that are small and maybe do some of the operational side, we'll get into that a bit. You still have that role to create policies that guide, how you will do your work. For boards that have staff, generally, there's a bit of an asterisk beside this one. But for many boards who work with a senior executive model, so Integra Board, we are a nonprofit and charity, much like most folks on this call today. The board has one employee, that is myself as a CEO, and then the organization has other employees. So it's that sort of that idea that you don't have the entire staff reporting to the board. You have that one person that sits between the operational side and the governance side. That is usually one employee. There are boards that do have one employee that's not an executive role, sometimes administrative function, organizations that are small where the board is probably a little more hands-on in terms of the operations. In that sense, the board should avoid management and operational decisions. And the boards govern, managers and staff operate. We'll talk about that. I think it's easier said than done. There's no sort of one right answer for that. It's a bit of a tension that we sort of find in that is where do you find that balance between governance and operations? So one thing the boards need to do, a few things we need to think about as boards, and all boards need to understand and practice good governance. Governance is it's like a muscle that you need to learn how to work with. It's not just showing up to board meetings and reading the packages, if somebody reads through the PLAST agenda or something like that. There is this idea that we need to work on our own governance, both individually and collectively. And good governance includes those things like being prepared, being informed, staying in your lane, all those kind of good things. Boards also need to focus on the long-term sustainability of the organization. I think this is one of the pieces we'll get to as we move forward. This is where should the board's attention focus? Should it focus on the day-to-day and kind of those things that we need to attend to all the time in organizations? Or do you lift your eyes to the horizon a bit? And what's the appropriate balance and how do you do that? Sort of the urgency of the day, especially for the last few years, is maybe more true than most, is that we have seen boards focus probably on the shorter term. That's okay in the short, for a while. The boards also have this responsibility to think about what's the long-term picture for the organization. Again, you ensure you have directions and you're going. So it's not just about saying we're looking at the future. We actually put some parameters around that in terms of planning and where you want to go. Again, hires, guides, and directs and evaluates the senior executives. You have a few different functions in that. It's not just hiring a CEO and let them run wild. It is making sure that there is that accountability and that authority. It certainly be a partnership, and there usually is when it functions well, a partnership between the senior executive and the board. But there's also that role where the board is your boss. And so how do you make sure you take that role quite seriously? That working through policy, we want to make sure that things are kept up to date and effective. It's probably the reality of most nonprofits is we write policies and they tend to be good for a while and they sit on the shelf and you kind of go back and think, I should probably dust that one off. So how do you make sure that if we are working through writing policies and creating policies that they actually are the right ones, they're up to date and they are relevant? Boards are responsible for their own work too. And this is one of the things that is a fundamental part of being a board is board self-governance, we would call this, that you're responsible for recruiting and developing your own board members. So taking care of your own house as a board, making sure you have the right people, making sure they're equipped and informed and all those kind of good things on an ongoing basis. That's a role that probably never ends for boards. And boards have a function of being ambassadors for the organization. I think this is a tremendously important role for boards that I think sometimes staff can't do. If you're out perhaps doing some fundraising work, or you're out in the community, or maybe you're doing some government relations work, to hear from a board member, somebody who's a volunteer, somebody who is there because of their passion, their interest in the organization, carries a different weight and a different nuance to it that staff probably can't bring. Staff can certainly be passionate, doesn't mean they're not skilled, but you bring in a board or a volunteer to speak to your organization, it certainly changes the message as well. And that is a fundamental part of being a board member. So we talk about the different roles. This plays out, I wouldn't say differently in every organization, but depending on the size and structure of your organization, we do see it play out in sort of three different buckets of work. Governors, the board of directors. These are the ones who set the tone for future direction through strategy and policy development. Governance, peer governance. All boards have this function. If you have staff, then you move into different parts of work, and management take over the sort of senior executive role. That's interpreting policy, making sure the day-to-day is done, planning, supervising, planning, all those types of things, managing organization, then implementation or operations, the day-to-day operations. Again, you may have boards that are small and they do all three of these roles, but recognize that you're wearing a different hat, as we would say sometimes in board development, is when you're governing, you're only focusing on the government aspect. When you're doing kind of the work of the organization, maybe you're now moving into that different part of the organization. So maybe you're a program volunteer, and you can be both. But it's important that when people see you and when you're working as a board, that you're really clear that the function we're doing today is as a board, and the other functions we do may have different sort of responsible that's attached to them. So board and staff. So if you're one of those organizations, and I think a lot are, probably about half the organizations in this province have some sort of staffing model out there. If you do have a staffing model, we'll talk a bit about some of the difference between staff and the executive director. So again, unpacking that CEO role, executive director role may have different titles. Certainly in arts organizations may structure it a little bit differently, but is that senior role, that one person, generally one person that sits between the board and the operations of the organization. The CEO executes the strategies and manages the operations of the organization. So the CEO and the staff team may have a role in planning, strategic planning, but they're also the ones who have to execute whatever plans you come up with. Building and sustaining relations with external stakeholders. Board can play that a bit, but largely that does tend to focus on the staff. The CEO reports to the board regularly on financial, operational, and strategic matters. So it's not that the CEO is hired to go do things and off they go. There are some board models that give the CEO a little more freedom in that area, but generally it is that idea that we're making sure there's connectivity there, that we're reporting back and making sure that there is a great flow of information. Providing budgets, operational plans, some of that again can be shared a bit. Certainly the operational side is more staffing. Sometimes that budgeting does sit back up at the board if you have a treasurer who's really engaged, but it really depends on the organization. The CEO can support development of the board, but it's a support role. It's not up to the executive director or the CEO to say, oh, we will attend to board governance or board self-governance. That is a function of the board, so we can support that, help them along the way, provide information, resources, and supports, but it is certainly a secondary role. And then the CEO can request consultation and support from the board members in their individual areas of expertise. And then probably the operative word here is request. So you may be on a board and thinking that there's lots I could offer to help and make this executive director's job a bit easier. And I'm sure that's true. But it is, if we're to stay in the lanes, as we say, of governance and management, it is to make sure that is by request and not just to offer advice or beyond advice and to get into that where we're sort of meddling in operational issues. Nothing sort of, I think, messes up organizations more when you get that lack of clarity and that lack of understanding of who's who and what their role is. And you start to move beyond those roles, it does tend to get a bit problematic. So the difference between the board and staff, these are different entities. And the board is the legal entity. It is there forever. And some of the differences we see in board and staff are that the board acts only as a group. You are a collective. You have only authority as a group. Staff act individually. You hire individuals. Not one individual is your senior staff, but the staff are generally individuals. The board is a continuous entity. The board does not begin and end until the organization ends. So there isn't the last board or the next board. The board is the board. But staff are temporary. Staff are here at the will of the board. If you're hired by a nonprofit, it may not seem fair, it may not seem right, but the board has legal authority and they have the right to bring in whomever they might want at any time to run the organization. Staff are elected or appointed, or board elected or appointed, sorry, staff are employed or contracted. Staff are there, board there voluntarily. Staff are generally paid. The board has an orientation for the future where the staff may be more focused on daily operations. It's probably a bit more of a gray area. I think there is a bit of a blended role there, but the staff certainly are on the day-to-day side of things or the month-to-month or year-to-year side. The board has all the authority. They can assign it away and the staff will receive the authority. Board sets policy, the staff will work within that policy. And the board are generally lay people where the staff have professional experience. And that can be a bit subjective perhaps, but what we've seen in the nonprofit sector, especially organizations that are getting to a bit larger size, is a professionalization of the sector over the last 20 or 30 years, where you have people who are very highly skilled at running nonprofits. Doesn't mean that board members are not passionate, not engaged, not have some subject matter expertise. They tend to come from a variety of backgrounds, and the operational side tends to be more a group of people who have, are the professional skills in terms of operating a nonprofit. So there's some inherent tensions. In theory, we can certainly talk about how things work really well in terms of boards and roles and responsibilities. It's really important to revisit those, to have conversations about those things, to see where it works, where there are challenges. Each organization is going to figure out their own way of doing things within some broad parameters. I think there are a couple of tensions, though, that always come up, and there's no necessarily right or wrong answer here, but there are tensions we need to wrestle with. And the tension of leadership is one of them. So who leads an organization? As we work with boards, this comes up time after time, is saying, well, who's really leading your organization. On paper, it is the board. The board is the ultimate authority. They are the legal authority of the organization. In reality, quite often it is the senior executive leading the organization. They're the ones setting vision. They're the ones sort of driving, coming with new ideas, making things happen. And, you know, both of those have some advantages. Both of those certainly have some, I think, great benefits. Sometimes it can be a point of, if not confusion or tension, but it should be a tension because it is a shared duty of leadership. And to figure out at different times, you might see one or the other groups rising a bit more in leadership. There's times, I think, in the last year, a couple of years, where we've become far more operational as nonprofits, as we sort of coped reactionary with COVID, perhaps, then perhaps some of that leadership shifted a bit more to the operational side, the executive side. Maybe we'll see it come back now to that strategic and generative side. We start to think a little longer term. There's always a tension there as to who leads an organization. And I think it's a good tension. I mean, it can be a good tension. There's used to be sort of an adage in the nonprofit world that either boards run roughshod over CEOs or CEOs run roughshod over boards. I don't think that needs to be the case because I think that tension can be a very healthy and creative tension, but one is always there no matter whom you are in an organization. Tension of position, you know, where boards sit. And it goes back to that opening quote that I shared, that boards sit both atop and outside the organization. And it is a challenging place to be. It's a very good place to be because it allows you to lead and allows you to lead without sort of being involved in operations. But to lead an organization from a position of sitting both atop with the authority and outside, where you don't necessarily have all the information that probably people running the organization have. So how do you make decisions that are in the best interest of the organization, that are in the best interest of the clients and the purpose of your organization, without having that knowledge and that understanding of what the organization is doing, where the issues are, who your stakeholders might be, and what they might be thinking. So that positional place where boards sit, I think, has some great advantages, but also has some challenges with it because you have to make decisions where you're not necessarily the best person to make a decision. I'm on a board, I'm on a couple of boards right now, and sometimes I think, boy, I may not quite know enough about what I need to know about this issue or this area we're talking about to actually make a real decision. I think that's a tension for most board members in different times and different situations. And the tension of time, you know, the tension of where should our focus be? Where should we be thinking as a board member? You know, should I be thinking about the day-to-day? Do I need to think about next year? Where should my horizon of time be? And that'll shift over time for different organizations, but where we sort of think, you know, we should be focusing our energies. Where should the board conversations be geared toward? Should they be talking about a funding contract that's coming up? Should they be talking about a program evaluation? Yes, but probably not. That should not be the end of their conversation. It should be a foundational piece of their overall discussions of where we're going as an organization and how shall we get there. So some of the things we're seeing right now in boards, we spend a lot of time with boards these days and talk to a lot of folks who are also working in this world. You know, we do see always there's a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities between either the overall board, individual board members. Again, this is ongoing work. It doesn't matter how long your board's been around or how many policies you've had to make sure that people understand their roles and how it works with new people coming on the board, with new circumstances, new situations, that role clarity. If there's one thing to talk about boards, you can go back to every board and talk about this and have a conversation about this probably every year. And it's always a worthwhile conversation to have. I think it's the challenge of engaging and utilizing the skills and expertise of boards. I think people tend to join boards because they believe in the organization, they believe in the cause, they believe in the purpose of the organization. But how do I bring my skills? How do I bring what I want to bring to this board in an appropriate way that's actually beneficial to the whole? So again, ongoing work, bit on the role side, bit on in terms of how we position and recruit and engage board members. We have seen a lot, I think, more than usual in the last 6 months to a year of just really stressed out relationships between boards and staff. And this is perhaps a bit of a COVID impact. I think there's a lot of burnout out there, a lot of challenges in terms of how people work. But it has been to the point of all-out warfare in some places. And I think that's just the diminished capacity of both organizations, of people in general, of boards. I think boards have been challenged through COVID to engage. So the next part about recruitment and engagement of board members, you know, it can always be a bit challenging to really engage board members in the most appropriate way. That idea of how do we play, where do we sit, what's our voice look like, how do we work with others? Those are not necessarily easy things. They're not insurmountable, but they're not necessarily easy topics. But COVID has made it tough. So boards are already challenged to engage, to have to do this through Zoom or do it remotely, to have your own stresses in life through the last few years. I think it's taken a toll on engagement and people want to be on boards. Now, I think the last few months, we're starting to see a bit more sunshine. We're seeing people starting to look a little farther down the road. It seems like some sense of normalcy is coming back. Doesn't necessarily mean we're getting back to where we were, but we are seeing, I think, some more, maybe positive signs of growth as spring hits here. And then just how the work gets done in boards is always a challenge. What's the best way to structure your board in terms of meetings or committees or how we do our work? This is something that's going to change from time to time. You may have got a board structure you put in place 5 or 10 years ago, and you think it worked then, but it needs to be revisited. So it's the idea, what's the form that you need to make sure you're able to function in the most appropriate way. Remember once I joined a board, one of the first boards I joined 20 years ago, perhaps, and they had 12 board committees. This is a board of 15 people. And you start to do the math on 12 committees and the amount of work you need to do. And finally, it pared it down to 8 or something like that. Still way too many. But we need to revise those things every now and then and make sure that it fits what the organization needs, but also fits the time, the skills, and the interests of board members themselves. So those are the things we're seeing right now. Maybe I'll stop there. Is there any questions, Liz, we want to chat about here? Why?
We don't have any questions at the moment, unless people want to pop any right now.
Well, I will keep going because I can talk all day. So here we go. If you have questions, throw it in the chat there. Liz will look for it and see if we can answer it at some point here. So that was kind of a very, very quick and brief view of Board 101. Sort of those really basic board functions, board staff relationships, what boards do. I want to give you a little bit more content now on a different theory or an evolving theory of governance. And this comes from a body of work called Governance of Leadership, what came out about 10 years ago. I think sort of built upon that very foundational principles of governance work and has taken it to perhaps a little bit of a different place here. And really, this came out of the idea that governance discussions had focused primarily on fiduciary duties, and that boards became instruments of accountability, not agents of change. And this is not saying that fiduciary duties are not important, that you should be those accountability because you have the accountability, you should have that role. But there's perhaps more to it than that. There is more to it than a board, about saying we're not just the ones to make sure we stay in their lanes and do the regulatory stuff right and make sure the audit's done and our budget balances and that we do all our emissions and all those sort of things. We've got to make sure that there's more to being a board than that. And I think that's what attracts most people to a board, is saying, how do we help this organization evolve and grow? So they talked about in this book, this is governance, you talk about 3 different parts of interconnected roles of boards. So you do start with fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty doesn't go anywhere. That stays in every organization. It is the legal constructs that sort of gives you the authority and the responsibility of being a board member. It's focused on the stewardship of your assets. So again, this is, taking care of assets, overseeing audits, budgets, risk management, those types of things. In this role, in this place, the board and the staff, the role of the board are really clearly defined. You have really strong, clearly defined, at least on paper, roles of board and staff, much like we've just gone through. Fiduciary governance is necessary, and you need to have that, but it's not the only thing you have. It limits the involvement and engagement of the board. There's only so much you can do on stewardship and taking care of making sure we're staying in the right lane. You can do this, and some boards only stay in this place, but it does perhaps tend to keep you from growing. It doesn't stretch and grow the organization. It doesn't give us a structure, a place to really play with some new ideas. And that's where they went to the next level of sort of thinking, and that was strategic. And that's creating on the strategic partnerships, management, think about the future of the organization. Where are we going to go? When we talk about strategic planning here at INTEGRAL, we do quite a bit of that as well. And strategic planning is kind of getting from A to B, where we understand where we are today is the A, and B is some place in the future, maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years. How do we get there? And boards do play a really big role in that. So understanding how the organization will get there, it does deepen the role of the board. It makes you the board now move from matters of how the mission and the purpose of the organization get to be enacted. In this role, though, boards should be focusing on directions and concepts, not on the details of the plan. That sort of moves it back to staff. So how do they help set directions, understand, discern where to go? There's lots of ways to get from point A to B and many different letters as well to head towards. But the idea of the concepts and making sure the broad directions are in place as the staff unpack and activate those things. This one, where you get that idea of a partnership between the CEO or the staff and the governance is clearly a partnership model. The idea of sort of setting out those medium-term directions as to where to go. It does involve more communication. That idea of boards sitting at top and outside the organization, you start to get into that dynamic where your boards need to have information to make those decisions. How do they hear from external stakeholders? How do they hear from perhaps clients? One of the things that anybody who's on a board here knows, or anybody's a CEO knows, or an executive director, when we report to the board, they tend to hear what we want to tell them. There may be some parameters around that, and it's not that we're trying to hide things, but we tend to tell them what we think is important. But that limits the perspective they have. So how do they have enough perspective and have information and awareness to actually make some decisions that are going to affect where the organization goes? So this requires more work than that. It requires some work for the CEO and the board to figure out how do we get information in the hands of folks so they actually make informed decisions. And the last part of their model was the generative part of governance. And so you have fiduciary, you have strategic, and now the third sort of pillar of governance is generative. And this is focusing the board and staff on sense-making the future of the organization, exploring new directions. So it can be a part of strategy, but I think it's even beyond that. This gets into areas that are quite, I think, almost existential. What an organization, should we exist? Have we, is it better to move, to merge with somebody else? Should we wind down? Is this even the way we're going, the right way to address the societal issue that we think we're about, or the group of stakeholders that we have been working with? Is the best way to do it? So this moves us into sort of those questions that are really challenging and really deep and probably a little longer term out there. This isn't about trying to make decisions. This is sense making. This is about the idea of trying to figure out, okay, in 10 years, what is the role for our organization? What are the needs we're addressing? You can bring some of those conversations into strategy work, but this is probably an ongoing piece, being aware of where we sit in terms of the ecosystem and the world we work within. This is, certainly probably a little more ambiguous piece of work. It should be very inclusive, creative. It should provoke a lot of thoughts, not necessarily set some directions. The idea is to always be asking questions and reframing issues. Now, you want to do this forever and sort of say that, you're always sort of rethinking your strategies. That's not what we're saying here. But to be aware that, none of us have sort of the God-given right to be here forever as nonprofits. The idea that we are temporary organizations, we don't quite think that way sometimes. So how do we really engage those questions, be open to the possibilities of what the future holds? This is a time when you really have to lay this sort of stuff out and work on it. This is like a muscle again. If you don't use this muscle, it's really hard to activate it. So how do you start to engage in some really challenging conversations where you sort of move beyond the current and the next few years to what's really going to happen down the road here? We have a toolkit up on our Integral Tools website of our critical conversations toolkit that gives some prompts in this way. But again, this is something you can put on some board agendas, maybe not all the time, but to sort of play with some ideas that are sort of down the road, bring in some data, bring in some different pieces to play with. We do a lot of trend work here at Integral. We're going to say, okay, if something's happened and we sort of see a longer term trend, what will this mean for us, not just today, but 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the road, if things like donations or trust tend to keep eroding the way they have been? Good questions for a board to think about, and another muscle to use. And those three are interconnected. You got to have the fiduciary, make sure that things are kept in order. You got to make sure you're thinking sort of in the medium term, where how you're going to get where you're going to go, but also be open to those bigger, broader questions of what's the role and purpose of the organization. Boards are really, and this is where boards are a great, I think, position to work in this area, because you do have this idea, you have the power. The boards have the authority in the organization to not do whatever they want, but to work within the lanes and the restrictions they have. But they are the authority of the organization. So when we think about where to go, all three of these areas do, come out of the board's area. There's a plurality there. The boards do have that variety of opinions. The nice thing, one of the most powerful things about being a board is you bring together 5, 10, 15 people who don't necessarily know each other and come from all kinds of backgrounds, have a common overlapping interest, but maybe not identical interest in the cause or the organization. But you get so many different perspectives and insights and expertise areas, and the wisdom that comes from that, if it's managed appropriately, is the ultimate power of a board, I think. And that position, again, the boards sit both atop and outside. You're not running day-to-day sort of conversations and day-to-day work, and so then you can have the freedom to sort of think longer term. I think that last piece of being generative and thinking about those really tough questions, the board is probably more or better equipped to sort of play that role than perhaps staff. As staff, we tend to spend our time thinking about how to get things done and how to, building programs and policies and processes, all that kind of things that we're quite proud of, and rightfully so. for the board to say, yeah, maybe we should do things a little bit different down the road, that can be a bit of a tension, but it's a good tension to have. So the board, in terms of where they sit, I think really has a great view of this kind of stuff. So just before we go back to questions here, I'll give you a couple things here to think about. If you're thinking about more information about boards, this has been just a really quick, get it started. Here's some bunch of stuff to think about. Where we go for our own sort of knowledge, it's certainly a couple things we like to point out. The Imagine Canada Standards program, the handbook itself, for those who haven't gone through the standards program, and then some on this call I know have, you don't have to be accredited by Imagine Canada to go through it, but you can go through the steps of looking at it, and they do break it down in governance by different size organizations. Is a nice little framework to say, where can I improve my organization? What do I need to think about? What policies do I need to have? Where areas should I focus on based on the sort of the size of organization I may be? So a good sort of framing piece to help you do some development. The Alberta Board of Government program, I think there's a couple of folks here from there today. Great resource in Alberta, which contains Alberta-based resources, which, most of the stuff I've given you today is a lot of Alberta content, some of the broader Canada content. It does change from province to province. Generally, the principles aren't bad, but some of the things you talk about, some of the definitions, you want to make sure that if you're getting resources, that you're not missing something that's Alberta-based. And the folks in culture have great materials and update the materials quite frequently, I think, in terms of putting some good stuff out there, and do some work in terms of workshops or working with individual boards as well. The Chartered Professional Accounts of Canada, accountants, in Canada, have a great, this is a fantastic resource for not just roles of boards in terms of nonprofit governance. They have risk management, they got some different financial handbooks, they've got all kinds of resources on nonprofit governance from so many different lenses. So if you're looking for really well done, really comprehensive, really easy to interact with materials, the Professional Accounts of Canada, fantastic site, all freely accessible out there. Everything here is pretty freely accessible. And then Board Source, some great material on Board Source. It's American, so again, that nuance perhaps you need to think a little bit about, making sure you're not just copying something because it sounds really interesting. But in terms of the theory or the way boards work, it's all, there's some great pieces there as well. So board effectiveness, organizational back, board culture, there's some really good pieces in that one that don't necessarily worry about a jurisdiction. Any questions? And I'm done. There we are. 45 minutes on the nose. Perfect. Liz, what do I need to answer for questions?
We mentioned several common issues. How would we address a few of those?
So the tensions, the common issues we're seeing on boards, what would we do to make sure nothing bad happens? I think some of it's proactive, certainly. We talk about things like lack of role clarity, that lack of understanding who's who in the zoo and what we're supposed to be doing. And I think it goes back to my point that, this is work that's ongoing work. To understand how your board or a board works is not something you do once and then it moves away again and you sort of deal with it at a board retreat a year later or 2 years or 5 years later. So the idea of making sure that roles are clear, that we understand what that means, both with new board members, with new staff members, and in different contexts, I think in different periods of time. So I think it's proactive. So making sure that, it's probably not the most, for most boards, it's probably not the easiest thing to say. Number one on our agenda this time is who are we as a board, and are we doing our work well? Are we, focusing on the things we need to focus on as a board? Most board agendas tend to focus sometimes on operational areas. Certainly, here's a report, here's finances, here's maybe some strategic conversation in there as well. But how do you put that in terms of a disciplined kind of approach to making sure the board attends to on a regular basis, and maybe every meeting, their own function, their own ability? So I think it's being proactive roles, making sure you attend to it. I think there are probably some other things. I think there's some idea of valuation too. I think we didn't talk about a board evaluation, but I think board evaluations or assessments, slightly different context, but how do boards understand their own function? And we do one that we offer for folks that has sort of two components to it: how the board overall functions, how we're working together as a collective, how we work with the CEO, how the chair works, but then also a component where it's, what's my role as a board member? So boards have that sort of dual sort of construct. We work collectively, but I need to bring something of who I am. I have responsibilities as an individual. So am I coming prepared to meetings? Am I giving, my insight? Do I speak freely? Do I do all the things I'm supposed to do as an individual board member? So I think there's some idea of, again, it's all a board development or governance in terms of how the board attends to its own work. but how do you make sure you be a bit more proactive on this? And then I guess that, what do you make sure to deal with these when they do happen is how to have conversations where some of these harder issues can really be addressed. If there's that fractured relationship side of things, if it's places where you got that tension between the board and the CEO, or sometimes we'll get it in founders and boards sometimes too. And that's where perhaps a third party can really help out. It doesn't have to be, certainly not necessarily us, we do this work, but other folks can certainly do it just as easily. But you bring in somebody who can actually help coach and mentor you through that, or facilitate some conversations, and to help folks understand perspectives and maybe stay in their lanes. So there might be some guidance out there as well.
Cool. Okay, we have another one. Can you speak to how the role of a board of a service club that has no employees might be different than an organization that does have employees?
Yeah, so I think in those kind of boards, and then that's probably half the boards in this province have no employees, or if they do, sometimes just an admin, not just an admin employee, certainly very valuable. So you tend to function all those three areas: the governance, management, and operations. You will work within all those three areas quite likely. So especially the first two, governance and management, that you are the governors of the organization. You do have that overall responsibility, but you're also now taking on that idea of managing, making sure that you do the work of the organization, or at least overseeing the work, and perhaps the actual work is done by volunteers in terms of implementation. But the important thing is to know that that's fine. There's nothing, that's a very common model. It's just that there's times when you need to be able to pull those apart a little bit. And when you're making decisions and doing planning, how much is a management decision? How much you're working on that operational side and keeping things going? And when do you sort of step back and make sure you're attending to the governance duties? Because when you mix those roles, it's hard to sort of think and act really distinctively. And so it might just take a little bit more work to make sure that we're really understanding governance really fully and understanding the management side really fully, even if we're doing both of those. So putting some structures in place on your agendas, or how you run your meeting, maybe how you do some of your structural work, that you may just make sure those roles are really, really clearly defined.
Examples of some services that we have provided in board development. These kind of range from development workshops with your board to coaching, and even some in-depth evaluations of governance policies. And so obviously every organization's context is different. So you might want to start with a short consultation. And so these consultations can just look like short conversations or 1-hour problem solving sessions called clinics between one of our integral experts, oftentimes it is Mike, and your team. And these consultations are free and also just part of our mission to educate and support Alberta nonprofits. So you can find out more by just visiting our website, or you can contact our main number, or you can contact our main admin email as well. If you do need more in-depth help, say with some sort of risk management policy or strategic planning, as I did see some thoughts about that in the chat, then all you need to do is just reach out to us, and we will try to figure out something that works with your specific needs.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Liz. Thanks for hosting us, and thanks all for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.